Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining. My name is Stephen, and I am going to be presenting to you the Insider's Guide to College Admissions. If you are not able to hear me, please note that this is being recorded and we will be sending you the recording tomorrow. So if there is an audio issue, fortunately, we can resolve that by sending you the recording. We also should note that you can ask questions in the chat box throughout, but I won't be taking questions until the end of the presentation, just to make sure that I'm able to complete the entire presentation. All of the participants are muted, but the way to ask a question obviously is through typing a text message on the question and answer chat box. And let's get started. And I know that several people, hundreds of people, will probably be joining in the next minute, and we'll have them catch up. So as I said, we're going to be talking about an insider's guide to college admissions and a little bit about AcceptU if you're not already familiar with our company. We are all former university admissions officers who provide one-on-one virtual support, which means phone, video, email, and texting. And we work on all aspects of the college admissions process. So for younger students, meaning 9th and 10th graders, we're helping them develop their profile, and we'll talk about that a bit later. And then for 11th and 12th graders, we're starting to think about more strategies. Which universities should they be applying to? Which standardized exams should they be taking? Which courses should students be taking? How do you write your essays in an effective way? Our experience, as I mentioned, is in the entire lot of us has worked in university admissions, and we have a combined 250 years of admissions experience, and more than 90% of our clients have been accepted into one of their top 3 choices. And we've been around since 2010. In fact, we were virtual even in 2010, and that was before people knew what virtual admissions counseling was. We, as a virtual company, have worked with probably 4,000 or 5,000 students over the last 10 years, and they represent, I think we've hit about 40 or 45 of the 50 states within the US, and probably about 25 to 30 different countries around the world. So our virtual nature does allow us to work with students regardless of location. A little bit about myself. As I mentioned, my name is Stephen, and I'm one of the co-founders of AcceptU. And I received a Bachelor of Arts degree from Cornell and a Master of Arts from Columbia University's Teachers College, that's their graduate school of education. And I also have a PhD from Rice University. In my 10 years at universities, I was at Cornell University for 4 years as an assistant dean of admissions, and then I was for 6 years an associate dean of graduate admissions at Princeton, and then I worked for 4 years as an independent admissions consultant before co-founding this organization. As I said, we were founded in 2010, and we're coming up on our 10-year anniversary. All of our counselors, as I mentioned, are former university admissions officers, and they represent all types of institutions, large and small, public and private, highly selective, smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges, and we have delivered nearly 50,000 hours of admissions counseling over our decade, and it puts us in a unique position to provide insider knowledge and guidance, and that's what we'll be talking about here. What kinds of things should your student be thinking about? How can you be preparing for younger students over the next 2 or 3 years? For those who are rising seniors, what can you do this summer and this fall? So this is the agenda. I'll be talking about how applications are read at the university level and what admissions officers are really looking for, what matters to them. I also think it's a smart idea to consider what we call hooks or special considerations. And then I want to give some tricks and tips about how you can stand out in the application pool. But it's also important to know why some applicants are not admitted, so you can avoid those pitfalls. So how are applications read? Well, this is an oversimplified graphic, an oversimplified version of what happens, but it generally does land this way at most universities, where once the students' applications are submitted, there can be literally thousands, if not tens of thousands of applications in one admissions office. And even the University of California system, most of the UC campuses are hitting 100,000 plus applications. So the university has to sort them somehow. And so they usually sort them rather by geography and or college division. This isn't exactly the case in all institutions, but this is very much the case at most places where the sorting process, if it's a larger university, your application for the College of Business will go into the pile of College of Business applicants. And if you're applying to the College of Engineering versus the College of Arts and Sciences versus the College of Communications versus the School of Education or the School of Music. So usually your application is being compared with others who are applying to the same academic division. Now, a university also will typically divide applications by geography. They're trying to compare apples and apples. So if you're from the Northeastern US, your application will probably be compared to others from the Northeastern US. If you're from the state of Texas, your application will likely be compared to others from the state of Texas. So geography does come into play. Again, they're trying to compare apples to apples. They're trying to have context make a difference, or context matters. It doesn't necessarily make sense to compare someone from, let's say, the rural part of the Midwestern United States with someone from New York City. They're having a very different experience, very different background, very different high schools. They might offer very different classes. In fact, that's why the admissions officers themselves are typically divided by geography. Those admissions officers read the same geography year after year after year so that they get to know the high schools in their region, they get to visit the high schools, they get to know the college counselors at those high schools, they understand where the student is coming from and what kind of context under which to read that application. So once those applications are sorted by geography or college division, sometimes they're sorted by geography and college division, then there's typically an individual reader. That might be called a screener. That person will read applications from that academic college or read applications from that geography. And that person is really trying to figure out if your application is admissible. And so they typically will have a yes, maybe, or no pile. And obviously, most of the applications are going to be in the maybe pile or the no pile. It's very rare that a first reader will take an application and say, yes, this student is getting admitted. It can happen, of course, but usually, and you'll see as you follow along on the graphic, most applications will be in the maybe pile. That means that others will be reviewing that application. You'll have a committee, sometimes of 2 or 3 people, who are going to be looking at that application and comparing all of those regions and all of those geographies and all of the applicants to figure out what their freshman class will look like. And that's an iterative process as well, meaning that committee will also sort applications into yeses and nos and maybes. And again, if there are maybes, then a different committee or a higher level committee will look at those new maybe applications to try and figure out, well, which one can we take? And applications, or rather universities, don't have necessarily a quotas system. They don't have a certain number that they're expecting from each high school or from each geography. The universities really try to have a fair range of students from all sorts of geographies, all sorts of backgrounds, and they want representation from all sorts of students. And so it is true that the universities, especially these committees and these higher level committees, are taking a very good look at what the entire freshman class is shaping up to be so that they have a lot of representation from all sorts of applicants. And they'll make admissions decisions when the earlier committees are undecided. What happens often is that a university will have, for better or worse, a large waiting list. And what that means, if there's a large waiting list, is that they couldn't necessarily make a decision on your application. And what that means is that the university is going to try and figure out if they, are you a student who was very strong but couldn't quite be admitted? They want to acknowledge to the student, to the guidance counselor, to the parents that you had a very strong application, that you had an application that was considered close to being admitted, but it's not necessarily, unfortunately, they didn't have room, if you will, for that particular student. So it's not a perfect process, and it is really challenging for admissions committees to make these decisions, because they are really trying to figure out, how do we balance the geography and these hooks, which we'll discuss later. How do we balance, how do we figure out, how do we get an entire freshman class that's representative of the applicant pool? So let me forward to the next slide. Well, what are admissions officers caring about? What matters most to them? Because what they want to know is really, or what you should say, what you want to know is, how do you get admitted? What kinds of things might matter most to you? So we'll talk about the grades, we'll talk about standardized tests, we'll talk about extracurricular activities, we'll talk about letters of recommendation. And so with the grades, this is always the most important criterion for applications, is what kinds of courses have you taken and how well did you do in those courses. We're looking for an upward trend in the rigor of your courses. So your 11th and 12th grade classes should absolutely be much more challenging and much more rigorous than the grades and the courses in your 9th and 10th. You should have an upward trend in your academic performance. And so what that means is that it's okay if your 9th grade marks aren't exactly what you wanted them to be. We want to see that you've done better in 10th grade. But as you can see on this slide, 11th and 12th grade are going to be the most important. So 11th grade is the last full year of courses that you're taking before your applications are submitted. So it's really important to do well in 11th grade. And then 12th grade, most people don't realize that your 12th grade marks really do matter quite a lot. You want to make sure that you're doing very well in your final year. You should be taking the most rigorous or challenging curriculum in your final year. And if that's the case, and you're doing quite well in 12th grade, that could tip the scales. That could actually help you get admitted. Now, also keep in mind that if you're on the 4-quarter system, as most of you are, sometimes you have a trimester system, it depends on the high school. Really what colleges are looking at is, what's your final grade for each course? Let's say you got a B and then a B and then an A and then an A for your 4 quarters. Well, if the teacher averages those out, she will probably give you a B+ or an A- for the entire year. Sometimes teachers will give you an A for the year because your second half was so strong compared to the first half. But colleges don't really care about the minutia. They don't really care about the details. What they want to know is, what is your year-end average for each of your courses? And they're not looking for perfection. Colleges are not looking for you to have an absolutely perfect GPA. Even the most highly selective universities are not looking for perfection, but they're looking for you to have challenged yourself. They're looking for you to have taken a very challenging and rigorous course load that you can handle. If your high school's on the AP curriculum and you take, let's say, 2 AP courses in junior year and then 4 AP courses in senior year, and your grades really drop or suffer from taking 2 up to 4 AP courses, maybe it was not a good idea to switch or to go up from 2 APs to 4 APs. But if you can handle a more challenging course load as you advance from 11 to 12, then that probably would be beneficial. That would be smart for you to take a more challenging course load as you advance. So you just want to do what's right for you. I never want someone to take, quote, the most challenging course load at their high school necessarily. I just want students to take the most challenging course load that they can handle without their grades dropping or suffering. So you know yourself best, or your parents know you best, or maybe your school counselor knows you well. And so it's really a smart idea to talk to students who are maybe 1 or 2 grades ahead of you to talk about how challenging are the courses at your school. Maybe it's good for you to talk to, or your parents to talk to other parents to figure out what should a rigorous course load look like at your particular school, because it does change from high school to high school. I also want people to know that I mentioned the 12th grade marks. Sometimes decisions are really based on your 12th grade. It's crazy, but it's true that if you're doing really well in grades 9, 10, and 11, and then suddenly you're not doing well at all in 12th grade, that will unfortunately matter. And the flip side is true too. If you're doing pretty okay in 9, 10, 11, and then suddenly you push the accelerator and you're doing incredibly well in 12th grade, that could be really fantastic, and that could get you admitted. Many people will ask the question, does 9th grade matter? And the reality is it depends on maybe the university. Sometimes it depends on the individual reader, admissions officer at the university. I actually did care about the 9th grade marks. There was a lot of forgiveness, but I always looked to see how did the student do in 9th grade. But we realized that it's a transition year, and sometimes students just unfortunately have a tough 9th grade, but then they really come into their own in 10th, 11th, and 12th. And that is true. Most admissions officers will be very forgiving or outright will overlook the marks from grade 9. So what else are colleges looking for? They're looking at the essays. I would say that this is probably the second most important criterion at universities, especially highly selective universities. They want to know who you are and how you think and how you analyze and how you critique. They want to get to know you as a person. And the reality is admissions officers don't interview very many students these days. Probably 30 years ago, everyone was very nervous about the scary admissions interview, but most students actually will have very few interviews, if any interviews, unless you're applying to small liberal arts colleges, and even there, most of those interviews will be optional. So the essays in some way took the place of the interview. It's your chance to give your voice. It's an opportunity for students to tell admissions officers who they are, what's your background. And so we want to know from your writing your point of view. How do you think? How do you analyze? We want to know, are you a likable individual? Are you someone that we'd want on our campus for the next 4 years? And it's obviously not quantifiable. It's more obviously subjective, not objective. But the reality is students can really give a lot of their personality. You could tell universities why that institution is of interest to you. That's an essay question that we see over and over again. Why are you applying to this university? You can tell universities what you want to study and why. You can tell universities maybe some obstacles that you've overcome. There are so many questions that you can answer. In fact, if you're applying to universities that use the common application, and there are 800 plus universities that use the common application, well, they have 7 essay questions. You have to choose only one of them. It's a 600 or so word essay, but it's really your time to figure out, how do I tell universities about me? And you have 7 essay options. Part of what we do at AcceptU is help students figure out, of these 7 essay questions, which one should you write about? Which one should you choose? And once you figure out which question, what topics are helping you put your best foot forward? So I can't emphasize enough the importance of the essays. It is true, though, that some universities de-emphasize the essays, and instead they're looking at other factors. They might be looking at the standardized test scores. They might be looking at your extracurriculars. So at a very highly selective or a selective university, the standardized testing often does come into play. This is going to be an interesting year, of course. If you're paying attention to the news, then you might have seen that so many universities in the last week, or certainly the last 2 or 3 months, have gone test optional. A lot of smaller liberal arts and sciences colleges have been test optional for the past 10 years. A liberal arts and sciences college, as a side note, is typically a liberal arts college, a college that offers non-professional or fields of study. So you won't see necessarily an engineering program or a business program or an education program or a college of communications and so forth, but you'll see the humanities and the social sciences and the sciences. That's what a small liberal arts college is. And there's no graduate programs or very few graduate programs, and there's usually about 500 to 2,500 students. In any case, the liberal arts colleges, or I like to call them liberal arts and sciences colleges, many of them, even the top 50 ranked, have been test optional for the past 10 years. Their point is, we don't really care that much about standardized tests. We think we can figure out who's a good match for our university based on your grades, your letters of recommendation, your rigor of curriculum, your essays, and like I said, an optional interview. Well, for those universities that still include standardized testing, which is a lot of universities with the exception of this year, they'll be looking for you to take either an SAT or an ACT. You won't need both. They'll be looking for you to take IB courses, or rather IB exams, if you're in an IB curriculum at your high school. If your high school offers an AP curriculum and you're taking AP courses, then they'll be looking for these AP exam scores. So the reality is, for those universities for this year, because of COVID-19, many universities have gone test optional. So I encourage you to go to the university websites and to figure out, do I need to take the SAT or the ACT? And you'll need to figure out, when are these exams offered, because many of them unfortunately have been canceled and then rescheduled. So I do want students to take these exams if you can, if it's not a hardship, if it's not a burden. In past years though, students would take probably 2 or 3 SATs or 2 or 3 ACTs and then just submit their best scores to the university. But the reality is, because so many exams were canceled this year, the colleges know that. So if the college still requires standardized testing, they're going to be very understanding and very forgiving that you might not, in fact, have taken the SAT 2 or 3 times like a normal year would have been the case. You might not have taken these exams multiple times. You might not have had as much time to prepare for these exams. So it'll be an interesting year. For those who are not aware, IB stands for the International Baccalaureate. A lot of schools outside of the US offer the IB program. It's similar to the AP program, but a lot of US high schools now offer the IB program. High schools usually make a determination, are we going to be an IB school or an AP school? AP, of course, is advanced placement. Some high schools offer both, some high schools offer neither, but I just wanted to make that clear. So there's also something called the SAT subject tests, which I did not even include on this slide. Those are exams that are no longer required by any university. Of course, if you want to take an SAT subject test, there are 20 such tests that you can take. There's a couple different math levels. There's biology and chemistry and physics and US history, world history, English, 10 foreign languages. So you can take SAT subject tests if you can find the time, if you can find a testing date, if you can prepare for them. They're 1-hour exams, so you can take 2 or 3 1-hour SAT subject tests in a given Saturday. But please note, no university as of this year will require SAT subject tests. If you are thinking of applying to a very highly selective university, then it is not uncommon to take SAT subject tests and to take, let's say, 2 of them. They're usually recommended, but no longer required. So like I said, it will be interesting. You should do your homework and figure out, do I need still to take the SAT or ACT, or am I applying to universities where these are now optional exams? For younger students, meaning those who are rising juniors and rising sophomores and rising freshmen, you should absolutely plan on taking these. They will likely be required by all of the universities on your list in 1 year. But for those who are rising seniors, again, you might not need these. I advise that you take these if you can, just so that you have them in your back pocket in case you apply to a university where they are required. Let's move on to extracurricular activities. Let's see, okay, I thought I had missed a slide. Extracurricular activities, This is also something that I want to give a notice, a caveat. Extracurricular activities can count anything. It could be something formal, it can be informal, it could be in school, out of school, in your community, at home on your own, and I'll give some examples. So if you apply to a university that uses the Common Application, which I mentioned earlier, there's actually 29 different categories, and there'll be academic categories, there'll be categories such as jobs, there will be categories like music and theater and other different types of clubs like the school newspaper and so forth, honor society. So I advise students to get involved in about 4 to 7 extracurricular activities over their 4 years of high school. So again, 4 to 7 extracurricular activities is something that you should think about. It gives universities a good sense of who you are. If you presented to me your resume and you had 0 extracurricular activities, I would have no idea who you are. If you presented to me your resume and you had 28 extracurricular activities, I would still have no idea who you are, because there's just too many. So that's why 4 to 7, it's a good goal, it's a good target, it's a good range. Colleges can get a sense of who you are based on what things you've done over your 4 years of high school. I advise that each of your activities, if possible, is a 2 or 3 or 4 year activity. Let's say you play ice hockey and you only play ice hockey in 9th grade. That's not very exciting. I don't think that much about you playing hockey for 1 year. But if you play hockey for 9 and 10, or even better, 9, 10, 11, or 9, 10, 11, 12, then I say, oh, wow, you're really a serious hockey player. And that's where you spent a lot of your time in high school. And then I get a good idea of who you are. It means that you are very dedicated. It means that you're committed. It means that you've spent a lot of time. I also understand that you're healthy, you're athletic, and so forth. Same thing is true. Let's say you're in the drama club for 1 year. That's not very exciting. It doesn't tell me that much about you. But if you did the drama club for 2 or 3 or 4 years, or maybe you did theater, summer theater locally during the summer, it says, oh, this is a drama kid. This is where he or she spent most of her time. So, it's just an opportunity for you to tell universities who you are and where you spent your time. Really though, what they're trying to do is figure out, if I admit you onto my university, who will you be? What kind of student will you be on my campus? If you did hockey for 4 years, you'll probably join a university, let's say intramural hockey team. If you did theater for 4 years of high school, you'll probably join the university theater groups or theater troops. If you did the school newspaper for 2 years or 3 years, you'll probably join my university newspaper. So it's really just about figuring out who you are, but also who you will be on my campus. I like to see leadership. I like for students to join clubs or activities for 2 or 3 years, so that by the time they're a junior or senior, then maybe you can become a president or vice president or treasurer or secretary or editor or captain or mentor or tutor or any kind of leadership position or leadership role, maybe a counselor. All sorts of things qualify, but it actually says a lot about you. You don't have to be a leader in everything you join. In fact, I would not expect that, but maybe 1 or 2 of your activities. And if you become a leader, it says that you are really committed, you're really involved, you really like that activity. But it also says that you can maybe command a room when you are talking to your peers. It maybe says that you're mature because you have to communicate with the advisor to your club. So anything that you do, I would say do it for 2 or 3 or 4 years if possible. Of course, there could be a very special one-time activity, and that might be, let's say, the summer after 10th grade or the summer after 11th grade. Well, of course, that's fine if it's a very special activity, like an internship at a company, or maybe there's a research project at a local university. That's not expected to be more than a one-time activity. Now, remember I said they could be formal or informal. So an informal activity, let's say you're really passionate about writing. Maybe, there's not a writing club at your school. Maybe you can create and found a writing club. That would be great. But maybe you're writing short stories or a play or a novel. Well, that's something that you should tell universities. They're not going to know unless you include that on your extracurricular resume. when you're applying to universities. Some universities even have an essay question that says, describe your favorite or most important extracurricular activity. And that's something that we, as admissions counselors, help our students with, is which activities do you want to include? Which ones do you want to exclude? You don't need to tell universities about every single extracurricular activity you've joined for your 4 years of high school. You just want to tell them about the activities that you've joined and then stuck with for 2 or 3 or 4 years, because that gives us a better picture of who you are. And another type of informal activity could be teaching yourself French cuisine cooking, or teaching yourself baking, or teaching yourself how to play the guitar, or teaching yourself a foreign language at home, or teaching yourself a new computer coding language. I actually just talked to someone today who said during this quarantine, he actually taught himself a new computer coding language. I had never heard of that language before, but that to me shows intellectual curiosity, it shows inquisitiveness, it shows dedication, it shows that, yeah, he was obviously passionate enough about computer science and computer programming languages to teach himself when he had some downtime. So colleges are interested in this sort of thing. They want to know who are you, and they can get a good sense, again, of who you are based on what you've done. If you are, as you can see, there could be pre-professional activities. That could be, like I mentioned, a job internship. But let's say you wanted to be a journalism major in college and then you want to work for a newspaper someday. Well, then joining your high school newspaper or joining a newspaper in your local town, that is a great pre-professional activity. What if you wanted to join the academic quiz bowl, or a science fair at your school, or I mentioned a research project at a local university? Those are really impressive academic activities. I like for students who maybe want to study international relations or international business, or maybe Latin American studies, or African literature, or European literature, or comparative lit, French lit. Any of those would be great for students who are doing travel or cultural immersion. Maybe your high school has an exchange program, not this year, but maybe in next year your high school has an exchange program with a high school from another country. That, to me, to any admissions officer, is really interesting and exciting. It shows that you're getting yourself out there in the world. It shows that you're more open to other cultures and other languages. It's very, very appealing to admissions officers. So there's not one right set of activities, and I will get every single day of my life the question, does this count as an extracurricular? Does that count? Is this a good activity? The reality is you want to do those things that interest and excite you. There's a few exceptions. One is video games. That does not count as an extracurricular activity. I guess maybe if you wanted to be a computer science major focusing on game design, they might be okay with video games. The other one, and I'm not saying this does not count, but if during your summers of high school you're doing a summer camp, there's nothing wrong with a general summer camp where there's canoeing and horseback riding, or I'm not sure what I didn't go to camp, but what other activities you might do at a summer camp. There's nothing wrong with that. You should continue to do that, but colleges won't be impressed by that. You don't need to share that with colleges. Now, if you're a counselor at that camp, that shows leadership. That I think they would like to see. But there are a lot of other summer camp type activities. For example, if you're really into debate at your high school, then sure, a debate camp, or a music camp, or a theater camp, or a journalism camp, or a pre-med camp. Those things I actually think are the kinds of camps that high school students should do during the summer. Now, let's talk about what's happening right now. You obviously probably cannot do any of those types of summer camps that I just mentioned, although some of them are coming back in July and August, I have heard. So if you can, I think they look great, but if you can't, that's okay. It's not held against you if you don't do those sorts of activities. And it's not necessarily in your favor to do those activities. However, when you're filling in your extracurricular activity, it does add a layer of depth. Or if you're writing your essay and they say, what do you want to study and why? And you've done some sort of extracurricular activity that can really help you write a better essay, that is interesting. If you wanted to be, let's say, a government major or political science major, and you've volunteered for a political campaign this summer, that actually is really interesting. So that's where an extracurricular activity can really help emphasize why you want to be a government major. It can actually help you write a really fantastic essay. And then you might say, well, I can't really volunteer for any campaigns this summer because are doing social distancing, but the reality is you could make phone calls, you can join virtually different campaigns. So think about taking a class online instead of a class locally at your community college. Maybe you can teach yourself. I mentioned French cuisine cooking. Maybe you can use online sources instead of going to the local culinary school. So, think about ways to alter how you would have done your activities. You want to do maybe a virtual version of those activities. So let's also talk about what's important to admissions officers. What are they looking for? Letters of recommendation. Now, I always say that you should submit X or X+1 letters of recommendation. And so if the university requires 2 letters, then you should send 2 or at most send 3. If the university does not require letters of recommendation, and a lot of large public comprehensive research universities do not require any letters of recommendation, then you don't need to submit any letters of recommendation. If the university says we don't require letters, but we allow you to submit, then sure, submit 1 or 2. But we don't want to be overwhelmed with letters of recommendation. The universities can get a good sense of who you are based on your school counselor's comments about you and 1 teacher or maybe 2 teachers. Sometimes actually the best letters of recommendation are not from your teachers, but from your supervisor outside of school. So if you have a job supervisor can write a really fantastic, interesting letter of recommendation where we learn something new and different about you. Maybe you're a referee for children's soccer. Well, maybe the league, the head of the league, the superintendent of the league can talk about you as a coach or a referee for children's soccer. Or maybe it's the advisor to one of your clubs. Maybe you didn't have that person as a teacher, but maybe she's your advisor to the club. I do like to get to know students in a different way. If you're having your teacher, well, almost always one of your teachers will probably be writing your letter of recommendation or a letter of recommendation. Your teacher should be in a field that interests you. What I mean is if you think you want to be a STEM major in college, science, technology, engineering, or mathematics, then probably a STEM teacher, one of your science or math teachers, should write one of your letters of recommendation. If you think you want to be a social sciences major in college, meaning economics or government or sociology or let's say Latin American studies or international relations or business or economics, anthropology, psychology, those sorts of things, then maybe your social sciences teachers in high school should write one of your letters of recommendation. You should get to know your school counselor. If you're at a small school, it's a lot easier to get to know your counselor. If you're at a very large school, you might not know your counselor. You might need to be proactive. If you're a freshman or sophomore or then you probably, I shouldn't say probably, you will still have a lot of time to get to know your school counselor, introduce yourself to that person. If you're a junior or finishing up junior year right about now, I hope you've gotten to know the school counselor, but it might make sense to have an email communication stream with your school counselor over the summer so that by the time you resume school in senior year this August or September, your school counselor has a better idea of who you are. That is one of your letters of recommendation if you're applying to schools that require letters. And like I said, consider non-academic LORs as well. But what else matters to admissions officers? So we would call these hooks or special considerations. And on the screen, I hope you can see the screen, you'll see geography and legacy and so forth. I'll describe each of these. So I've mentioned geography earlier, saying most universities will divide their student applications into various geographies, whether it's all students who are international versus, I don't know, students who are from South America versus Asia versus Europe. Within the states, you'll probably be divided into your own state or various counties within the state. So geography matters. The farther away from the university, the better off your chances, to be quite honest. And I'm not telling you suddenly to go look at universities that are not nearby. Most students do apply to universities within 200 miles of where they live. So, if you apply to universities within 200 miles of where you live, that's okay. So does So does everyone else practically. But admittedly, you will get an advantage, a geographic advantage, if you apply to universities that are farther away, because the universities want a geographic distribution of students. If you're from an underrepresented state, let's say you're from a state that's not highly populated, or let's say you're from a rural town in the Midwest, but you're applying to universities in Connecticut, well, there aren't going to be a lot of people from Oklahoma or from Nebraska or Kansas necessarily who are applying to universities that far away. So you could have special consideration. In fact, I have two cousins from Oklahoma who applied to universities in the Northeast in New England, and I'm certain that was helpful in their application because there's not a lot of Oklahomans in those New England universities. What if you're a legacy? What does that mean? So basically, if you have a parent or grandparent who attended a particular university, they might have some advantage, slight advantage, I should say, preference towards people who are legacies, meaning a parent or grandparent has attended. If you have an older sibling who attends or in the past attended that university, it's not technically a legacy advantage, but the universities do like to give special consideration to someone who's applying where there have been past family members. It's actually considered very controversial, saying, well, why should I get an advantage because my parent or grandparent? And so some universities really don't give much of an advantage. Some universities give only the slightest leg up, if you will. Musical talent's really important. I'm not saying that you suddenly have to send in a CD or a recording, and you don't have to apply as a music major, but it is very appealing. Let's say you wanted to be a chemical engineering major or a linguistics major or something like a business major. It's very appealing for those types of students to submit a recording of their music if you feel that your vocal talent or your instrument talent is very strong. It's not going to hurt you, but it could possibly help you. Something to think about. Same thing with artistic talent. If you're not applying for a portfolio major, meaning art, architecture, graphic design, interior design, and fashion design, if you're not applying for those types of majors, then it actually could be interesting for you to submit a portfolio. Let's say you're applying as a chemical engineer, but you're a really talented photographer, you might want to submit your photography portfolio. If you are applying for an architecture or art or fashion design major, then of course the portfolio will be required. I'm talking about for those who don't need a portfolio but submit one anyway. Can that help? The answer is yes. Other things, if you're a recruited athlete, very, very few students are ever going to be recruited athletes. It's the most elite level for your sport. Now there's different divisions at the universities. There's D1, Division 1, D2, and D3. The D1 sports or the D1 universities are by far the most competitive, and only the most elite athletes will ever get recruited for those. But most of the students that we as a company, AcceptU, that we work with that are considering recruitment, they're usually looking at D3, the smaller colleges that are not necessarily the most competitive athletically. They're still very, very strong athletically, but they're not going to the Olympics. So can that help with getting admitted to a university? Without a doubt, because the universities are looking for all sorts of people. What about gender? Can that help? Yes. If you are a male applying to, let's say, a small liberal arts and sciences college, that could help, because a lot of the small liberal arts colleges are usually about 60% women and 40% men. So they'll be trying to get to 50-50. Same thing, if you're a woman applying to business or engineering, you could have an advantage because those fields, business sometimes is 60% or 70% men. They're looking for 50-50. Same thing with engineering. Engineering might be, let's say, only 30 to 40% women. They're looking to get to 50-50. So it could help for women applying to business or engineering. It could help for men applying to colleges that have an imbalance with regard to male-female percentages. Ethnic diversity, absolutely. The universities are looking to have racially and ethnically diverse campuses. And so colleges will act affirmatively on an applicant. If two applications are considered equal, I know that's impossible for two applications to be considered equal, but if two applications have very similar standardized tests and extracurricular profiles and very similar grades and rigors of curriculum and such, then and the university really only has one space left, and they will act affirmatively on that student who is more underrepresented because the university will want more of different types of ethnicities and races on their campus. Now, I do also have on here VIPs and donors only for completeness. People will ask the question, does that really matter? Can donors really get an inside track or get admitted for special consideration? I mean, and if I'm being honest, yes, if someone donates literally millions, if not tens of millions to a university, of course, they will probably be considered favorably. VIPs, you don't see it very often, but someone who is a famous applicant, like an actor, a child actor, or maybe even the child of famous people or government folks, they will have special consideration. I don't have on here, I should have on here, first generation students as well. If someone is the first in his or her family to go to college, that universities will act affirmatively on that applicant as well, because they want to in some ways democratize the process and give an advantage to someone who perhaps was disadvantaged because they don't have a familial background when it comes to admissions. So what we call those special considerations, I mentioned this earlier, are hooks. And that's just an admissions term. Do you have a hook? It's okay if you don't. And people will say, oh, I wish I did. I don't have any of those things. But the reality is you don't need to have a hook, but you need to have really strong grades, really strong rigor of curriculum, really strong standardized tests if they're required, excellent essays. But it might be helpful if you are maybe applying to a college, like I said, geographically distant, or maybe you submit a portfolio of your art even when it's not required. So maybe you do have a hook and you did not even realize it. So how do you stand out in the applicant pool? Well, you want to demonstrate interest if possible. So demonstrating interest means visiting the university. Of course, you can't really visit universities these days, and hopefully that will resume, but that is one way to demonstrate interest. Most universities, not all, but most universities, especially smaller universities, private universities, they track who visits campus. And so they're trying to figure out, if we admit you, are you likely to enroll? And the universities really are probably going to admit someone that they think will enroll. So you want the university to know that you're genuinely interested in that institution. Now, if you cannot visit universities, you can maybe demonstrate interest by going to the university website and getting on the university mailing list. Or if the university visits you this fall or next year, and then you should let the university know that you have gone to their local event. They might go to a college fair, they might go to something called a prospect program. There's also something called well-rounded versus well-lopsided. You can stand out either way. A well-rounded student is one who has lots of different types of extracurricular activities. Like I said, 4 to 7 extracurricular activities, 2 or 3 or 4 years of each activity. A well-lopsided student, it's really not a term, but we've made it up, but a well-lopsided student is one who maybe doesn't have lots of activities, but has maybe 2 or 3 activities, but has a lot of depth. Let's say you wanted to be an astronomy major and you have so many things on your profile that scream astronomy, that actually stands out. That's not very common, so it's very, very interesting to admissions officers. I've mentioned several times how important writing really strong, engaging, and memorable essays is. And you also want to think about taking initiative. I said maybe you should start a club at your school if there's not a writers club, was the example I gave earlier. Or maybe there's something in your community. I know a lot of students have been taking initiative over the last 3 months or 2 months with creating masks, and well, not N95 masks, but masks that people can wear around town. And so that's a really great initiative. Maybe some students have created campaigns to raise money for their local clinics or hospitals or healthcare workers. So those types of initiatives are really exciting and interesting. I just don't want people to think that they can't stand out or they can't take initiative during this time. And I also do want you to think about doing something that not everyone else is doing. And so oftentimes students will join an activity because they see everyone else is joining that activity and they think, well, I'm going to stand out like a sore thumb. I'm going to, I'm going to stand out if I don't do the activity that everyone else is doing. Well, that's the point. You do want to stand out. You don't want to do what everyone else is doing. So I think people need to sort of rewire their brains and say, well, if everyone's joining the XYZ club, maybe I don't need to join it. Maybe I'll stand out if I don't join that club. Now, the reality is if all your friends are joining a club, I'm not saying it's bad for you to join that club. Of course, you're going to want to join it. All of your friends have joined it. But the reality is think about in addition to that club, is there anything you can do that is different or unique and that really screams you? So why do some applicants not get in? Well, the first one is really geared towards the most highly selective universities. You might be surprised if there's someone at your school who's 1 or 2 years ahead of you and that student is absolutely brilliant. And you say, how did he or she not get in? That person is incredible. I've never met a smarter person in my life with all A's and A pluses and perfect standardized tests. Well, the reality is it's not all about that. It's all of these other things that I've mentioned, your extracurriculars and your essays and your letters of recommendation. I cannot emphasize enough how important those things are too. And so it's not enough to be brilliant. You don't want to be boring. You want to be interesting and likable. You also might not get admitted to a university, not because of anything you've done, but because of limited space. You'll remember I talked about, sometimes the universities just can't make a decision on your application. After iterative committee meetings, they might end up saying, well, we'll just put you on the wait list. We like you, you're very strong, but we have so many students from your geography or so many students who want to study the same major as you or something like that. So you want to be different. You want to, hopefully it's not you hopefully have something that compels the admissions committee to say, yeah, I know you have limited space, but take me over someone else. Well, you want to come across as likable in your essays and in your extracurricular activities and in your letters of recommendation. If you come across as someone that they don't necessarily want to meet, well, unfortunately, with very selective universities these days, that's just not going to get you admitted. You want to make sure that you do a lot in your high school for 2 or 3 or 4 years. So again, the admissions officers, can see the potential contributions that you would make when you get to their university. But you also want to be realistic. You cannot apply to, I'll just pick on them, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford if you don't have the scores and the grades. It's just not worth applying to the schools that are not a good fit or not a good match for your academic profile and of course for your social profile as well. But if your academics are not really where they need to be for certain universities, it's really not a good use of your time to apply to those schools because it's so much energy and effort to apply to a university that you want to apply to the ones that are really well matched for you. You also don't want to land at a university and then not do well there. That's not very useful. Let's say you got into Harvard but then failed out or graduated with a C- average. Is that really great for your ego or for graduate school or for getting a job? No, you'd be much better off going to, let's say, the University of Massachusetts and getting an A average there than going to Harvard, which is only an hour and a half away, and getting a C- or D average. You also want to have minimize, I should say, red flags. You don't want red flags on your profile, meaning something that stands out on your, either from a letter of recommendation from your guidance counselor or anything that maybe if you have an interview with an alumnus or an interview with the admissions office, you just don't want anything that's a red flag to stand out. That could be a reason for not being admitted. So just to tell you a little bit about AcceptU, and then I see a ton of questions have come in. So I'll take questions for about 10 minutes. I don't want to keep you too long past the hour. So this is just something we call the AcceptU difference. In the leftmost column, of course, are various universities. And this is over, I think, the past, let's say, 4 or so years. These are the admit rates for the university. Actually, some of them have even gone lower, probably in the last 6 months, but these are the university admit rates, I think, a year ago. And then these are the admit rates for our students, an average over the past 4 years. So let's say 19% for Columbia, let's round up and call it 20%. That means of our, let's say 100 students who have applied to Columbia over the past 5 years, 19, i.e. 19% of them have gotten in. So it does show you that we do have a very strong track record, even with some of the most highly selective universities. It's not a perfect system, obviously. And sometimes we'll see students who get admitted to, let's say, 3 amazing universities and then not admitted to 3 other amazing universities. And you might say, how is that possible? Well, the universities have profiles, the universities have personalities, the universities are looking for different things. The university admissions officers are human, and maybe the university admissions officers at the first 3 universities really liked your application, and for whatever reason, the admissions officers at the next 3, it wasn't a good fit. They didn't see you as matching for what they are looking for. So on this slide, I'll leave this up as I answer lots of questions, and basically contact us if you're interested in a consultation with one of our former admissions officers. You can contact us on this screen, and then there's obviously our social media and so forth. And we'll also send out this recording to everyone, I believe, tomorrow or the following day, so that if you missed something I said, hopefully you can fast forward and catch up. I wanted to talk about, let's see, the first one, someone asked, I know a lot of questions will come in about standardized tests, so I'll take this one. It says, if test optional, or if the school has become test optional, how high should your SAT be to submit it? That's a really great question. It's a really tough one to answer as well. What I would say is, let's see if that score reflects who you are. Does that score reflect your strengths? Does that score maybe tell about, you know, your strength in math if you wanted to be a STEM major, or your strength on the evidence-based reading and writing section if you want to be more of a humanities-based major? I would also look at the average SATs from previous years for that institution. I would also look at the middle 50th percentile SATs. What I mean is, let's say the published middle 50th percentile is from a 1200 to a 1400 for University X. What does that mean? It means that 25% of students have an 1190 or lower at University X, and it means that 25% of students have a 1410 or higher, right? Because that means 50% of students have between a 1200 and a 1400. So if you are in that top 25%, even if you have only taken the SAT once, or if you're in that middle 50th percentile, that should tell you, you know, should I submit my SAT if that university is now test optional? It's not a black and white question, and it's not a black and white answer. And that's something that we're going to have a lot of conversations with our students this summer and this fall, because our students will be applying to universities that are test optional. Our students will be applying with only 1 SAT completed instead of the usual 2 or 3. Someone else asked, for SAT subject tests, are they optional? Yeah, the answer is yes. There is, as of this year, no university requires SAT subject tests. No university, not one. Some people think that Georgetown University requires 3. Georgetown actually does not require any SAT subject tests. They require 0. They recommend 3, and all the other top 20 type universities, if you will, often will recommend 2, but they're not required. MIT even said, we're not even going to look at them. So, you know, I don't want students to take SAT subject tests unless they have time and they've studied for them and they think that they can do really well on them. Take them, because even if the university does not require them, you still can submit them. And if they're really strong, it could be another reason for a university to admit you. So someone asked about volunteering as an important extracurricular. I like how you worded that. Is it an important extracurricular? Well, you know, I think that extracurriculars think about the word extracurricular, above the curriculum. So I wouldn't say that volunteering is important. It's funny because I get this question about once a week, every day, or every week of my life. Do I need to do volunteer work and community service? Is it required? Does it look good to universities and so on? The reality is no university, to my knowledge, I mean, there might be one or two, but no university requires volunteer work or community service. And so it is not required. Is it a good thing to do? Yes, because you're doing good for your community. You're learning a lot about yourself as a student if you're doing volunteer work for others in your community and so forth. So I like when students have volunteer work on their profile, but it's not required. And so some high schools have let's say a graduation requirement where you have to do 40 or 60 hours of volunteer work over your 4 years of high school. And that's what students do. They'll do the 40 or 60 hours and then they're done and then they can graduate. Is that impressive to universities? No, they know that you were doing, I mean, that averages out to about 1 hour a month for 4 years. It's not, that involved or that important. So if universities can tell that you're doing volunteer work because it's a high school graduation requirement, that's not exciting. But at that same high school, if you have 40 hours required to graduate, but you do 260 hours of extracurricular volunteer work and community service, then yeah, that shows that it was important to you. You were passionate about that. Someone asked, if I don't get any leadership roles, will that crush my application future? No, that is not a deal breaker. I think that's what you meant. Is it a deal breaker if I don't get any leadership roles? It is not. It is not a requirement. It's just appealing. And what I will say is I like when students can get leadership roles for those reasons I mentioned earlier. But if you don't have them, it's not going to negatively affect your admissibility, with the exception of, I will be honest, I think the most highly selective universities will probably look for and expect that you have leadership roles in maybe 1 or 2 of your activities, if not more. And so I don't want you to think that it means president. As I mentioned earlier, it could be president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, editor, captain, any of those things. But it could also be a mentor to a young student. It could also be a tutor to a young student. So if you say, oh, I can't get a leadership role, and I say, well, if you became a mentor and you're in 11th or 12th grade and you became a mentor to a 9th grader, isn't that a leadership role? The answer is yes. So I think that students can find leadership roles if they seek them out. And if they, in some ways, change in their mind, what does it mean to be a leader? So someone else asked, with regard to extracurricular activities, would attendance at the National Student Leadership Conference count? And the answer is yes. I think that shows that you weren't just a leader, but you went to a conference, there was a national conference, and you're learning to become even a better leader. And that's what I was talking about earlier. I like those summer programs or those summer activities, like I mentioned debate camp, and I mentioned theater camp, and I've seen pre-med camps and pre-vet camps and journalism camps and so forth. And usually it's 1 or 2 weeks, and sometimes it's longer. But yeah, if it's a leadership or some sort of themed camp, I like that. I think that shows dedication. It means that you really were genuinely interested in this. And so let's change. I've seen some other questions about letters of recommendation. Here's one. What about an art teacher providing a letter of recommendation? Yes, if the student wants to do an art-related field, I almost would, I don't want to say require, but I'd almost require that the art teacher does write one of the letters. If your high school offers AP Studio Art or AP Art History and you're really serious about art or art history, I think absolutely get to know the art teachers, the art history teachers. You might want to do a summer, probably not this summer, but in the future, a summer volunteering at the local art museum if you live in or near a city, or a gallery. Maybe there's a gallery if you live in a smaller town. Those are the kinds of things that I want to see. Let's see, the next one, what if the school counselor has not been approachable by the student or made him or herself available? That's a really good question. That's really tough. We usually will see that at the larger high schools, right? And so that would be the one advantage. I mean, there are probably several, but the one advantage to a smaller school is really that interaction with the school counselor. I wonder if it's possible to change school counselors. If it's not possible, then I would look at it this way. The school counselor probably will not write a negative letter of recommendation. That is almost unheard of. It might be more on the neutral side. And I don't want you to be harmed by that or think that that's harmful. In fact, a neutral letter of recommendation is fine. We'll always see neutral or good or great. We rarely see anything less than neutral. I mean, it's not ideal, obviously, if it's a neutral letter of recommendation versus all of these other students at other schools are getting glowing letters from their school counselors. But I mean, I would then sort of compensate for a neutral letter of recommendation by having incredibly strong ones. Like I said earlier, you can submit X or X+1 letters of recommendation. This might be the time to get an X+1 to try and compensate for a neutral letter of recommendation with some outstanding ones from people who know your child much better. Other questions, and let's see. Sorry, I know that we're over time, so I'll take a few more. Oh, here's a great one. How long do admissions officers spend reading your application? I meant to mention this earlier, and I actually, it changes from university to university. At the small liberal arts colleges that I was describing earlier, one of our counselors who works for AcceptU, he used to work for Occidental College. We call it Oxy in Los Angeles. So Occidental College is a top, I don't know what its ranking is. I don't really care about ranks, but let's say a top 25 or top 40 or something, liberal arts national college. It's one of the best. He said that they'll spend something like 25 minutes reading and reviewing and discussing each application. So that is an advantage of the smaller liberal arts colleges. They don't get nearly as many applications, so they can spend a lot of time really looking at each one. At the larger universities, they honestly probably spend, and I don't mean to scare anyone, but on the order of, I would say 8 to 10 minutes is the norm. But that's why you want to be in that maybe pile. Well, of course you want to be in the yes pile, but most people are going to be in the maybe pile. And if you get in the maybe pile and your application is read by someone for 8 to 10 minutes, and then it goes to another committee of 2 or 3 people, well, each of those people will read it for 8 to 10 minutes. Well, think about it. What if it's a committee of 3 people? That's 8 times 3 or 10 times 3. So that's 24 to 30 more minutes of attention paid by admissions officers to your child's application. So that's why you want it to be a solid enough application. That's why you want it to be a strong enough application to get past that first read. That's why I said if a student has terrible grades and terrible scores, he should not apply to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, and Stanford. You should apply to schools where you're going to get past the first read. And then once you get past that first read where they're looking probably mostly at your grades and your scores and your quote unquote admissibility, then we want admissions officers to really dig deeper into your application, your letters of recommendation, your essays, and so forth. That's another reason why I always say to people, look, if there's a grammatical error on your essay, it's okay. It does not need to be perfect. They're not spending a lot of time on these essays. They're reading them pretty quickly for content, for also to get a feel for who the student is and what kinds of things she has to say and who she is as a person, but they're not sitting there with a red pen and doing grammar corrections like your high school English teacher might. So someone else asked, what about, let's see. Yeah, so I'm a rising high school senior and have not had an opportunity to join organizations or extracurricular activities in the past 3 years for financial and personal reasons. And if you're in an honor society, you've recently been accepted to an honor society and a leadership program, I think that is fantastic. And in fact, I'm so glad you asked this question because I don't want students to think that you have to have what I mentioned, 3 years or 4 years of each of your extracurricular activities. Of course, there are extenuating circumstances, and colleges get that. Colleges, admissions officers are humans. I mentioned this already twice, so they know. But you have to make it clear to the universities why you were not able to get involved in extracurriculars for the first 2 years or 2.5 years of high school, they'll totally understand that. And in fact, when you mentioned that maybe your family had some financial hardships, oftentimes that means the student had to go get a job, let's say at Starbucks or Target or something. Well, that actually does count as an extracurricular. So you might have extracurricular, or even babysitting, you might have extracurriculars and you don't know it. There's even a category on the Common Application called, I don't know the exact title, but something like family assistance. So that means helping care for younger siblings actually is an extracurricular activity. So don't sell yourself short. You might actually have more extracurricular activities, but now that you've been exposed to and have gotten involved in a couple extracurriculars at the end of junior year, fantastic. Let's stick with those things at the beginning and all throughout senior year so they actually have become 2-year activities. And maybe there's some cool activity that you can do on your own at home this summer, and that'll be a third extracurricular activity. So I didn't mean to scare anyone by saying you had to have 4 to 7 extracurricular activities, but if there aren't extenuating circumstances, it's something to think about. And again, I realize that the people who are listening to this webinar might be 9th and 10th graders, so I'm trying to give them a sense of what kinds of things they maybe should be thinking about for the next 2 or 3 years. If you're a rising senior, meaning you're going to start your senior year in August or September, obviously the past is in the past, but what can you do for the rest of the summer? What can you do in senior year? Let's see, and I'll take a few other questions. Someone asked, how can I be a student with AcceptU? Great question. So we are, as I said, a college admissions consulting firm. And so all of our counselors work one-on-one with students, and we do this over video and phone and email and text. And so contact us on this web page that you see right here, acceptu.com/consult, and you'll be connected with one of my colleagues who will talk to you about, we have basically a simple intake questionnaire that we require people to fill out. We want to get to know the students and give some advice to families as well. So we work with parents and students in different levels. Some people work with us for all 4 years of high school. Some people just work with us for 10 hours. Some people just work with us on 5 essays. And so we always hope to try and find a different package that helps students figure out, or helps parents, I should say, figure out what is the right package for you. Well, we're over time, and I see there's probably another 50 questions. So I apologize I didn't get a chance to answer those questions, but what I would recommend is setting up a consultation on our page right here so that you can have your questions answered, and that will hopefully give you an opportunity to ask not just the one question here that I wasn't able to get to, but you might have other questions. We'll also have additional webinars in the future, I'm sure, where it's just Q&A, where we probably just do an hour of questions and answered, and on a future webinar, that's where you'll get your questions answered as well. So I want to thank you for all of your questions. Thank you for your attention and your time. Hopefully you learned something tonight, and look for a recording tomorrow so that we can, we'll send this to you and make contact with you thereafter. Hope everyone has a fantastic evening. Good night.